Welcome back to The Heat. The UN mission in Afghanistan described Friday's suicide attacks in the Afghan capital Kabul as the country's single most violent day since the UN started documenting civilian casualties in 2009. The Taliban has claimed responsibility for 2 of the attacks that killed dozens of people and injured hundreds more. Joining us once again is Ambassador Omar. He's a senior advisor to Afghanistan's chief executive. From New York, we're joined by Anand Gopal. He's the author of No Good Men Among the Living: America, the Taliban, and the War Through Afghan Eyes. Joining us from Shanghai is Shao Yuqun. She's a scholar from the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. And right here in Washington with me is Andrew Small. He's the author of The China-Pakistan Axis, Asia's New Geopolitics. Again, thanks to all of you. Ambassador Samad, what is the current status of talks with the Taliban, between the Afghan government and the Taliban? Has it been suspended? Are there any attempts to restart these talks?
Well, the talks are on hold. We have made clear that we're open to continuing talks, but we're not going to engage in talks with parties that are either involved in an infighting situation or a Taliban organization that is splintered or a lack of clarity on the part of Pakistan. I think that the Afghan government wants clarity, and it wants to assure the Afghan people, after the mayhem of the last few days, that talks do not mean more fighting. And if the Taliban are using talks as a tactic to put pressure, it's not going to work. The Afghan people are going to reject it, and it's going to make it more difficult and probably prolong the process indefinitely if there's no clarity and if there's no cessation of hostilities.
Anand, what do we know about the new leader of the Taliban, Mullah Mansour?
Well, he's somebody who was one of the original members of the Taliban going back to the mid-90s. He headed the Taliban Air Force at the time, and he wasn't very high up in the hierarchy of the Taliban, but what happened after 2001 was that a number of the more senior leaders were either killed or arrested, and through that he kind of rose the ranks. He has a reputation within the Taliban of being a relative moderate compared to some of the other hardliners, but it remains to be seen how that would be expressed, because, as I said, at the moment he is worried about consolidating his base. There's real threats to his succession, notably from the family of Mullah Omar, as well as other elements within the Taliban who are opposed to peace talks. And so at the moment, I think there's the idea of peace talks are going to be on hold until he's able to consolidate forces and get the majority of the movement behind him. This is a very fragmented movement. It's been increasingly fragmented over the years, and the movement he's inheriting now is one that is called the Taliban, but really is increasingly becoming a collection of different armed factions and groups.
Right, and Andrew, you have written that Mullah Omar, the Taliban leader who has died, was a man that the Chinese could do business with. So in a sense, has his death been a bit of a blow to the Chinese?
In a sense. I mean, I think the hope on China's part was firstly that they had a direct relationship with him that had involved, for instance, agreements regarding how the Taliban would approach Uyghur militant groups, to take one example. On the basis of his authority, I think to a certain extent, the Taliban adhered to some of these agreements that had been reached, but a lot of that rested on his personal authority. As the Taliban becomes more fragmented, those agreements, in a sense, take a hit. And also, China was probably the biggest external supporter, the country most keen to see this peace process happen and succeed. And so I think the implications of his death, not just for the immediate peace process, but if an agreement were to be reached at some later stage, the thought was that Mullah Omar was the figure who might have the authority to hold it together, to bring all of the different factions, or enough of the different factions, to the table to make a deal stick. China's concern will be that you now don't have a figure like that within the movement. So even if the peace process does pick up at a later stage, the danger is that the outcome of that process will still result in a level of fragmentation and a number of groups that will refuse to support the outcome.
And no doubt China wants to see that peace process succeed because, as the Voice of America has been reporting, can a breakdown in security in Afghanistan fuel Uyghur separatism in the Xinjiang region?
The concern is that, as in the 1990s, Afghanistan becomes a safe haven for militant, Uyghur militant groups, right. And that even if significant parts of the territory are under the control of the Taliban, and a Taliban that is no longer quite as willing to stick to some of these agreements that they had with the Chinese government, then that starts to become a more difficult environment. And whether there's direct spillover in terms of fighters moving back and forth, that's less clear. What you may have, as you had in Pakistan for a number of years, is that fighters who have a safe haven that are able to put out propaganda material and these sorts of things could act as an external ideological inspiration for groups within Xinjiang. So there's a number of concerns of that sort that China has.
Yuqing, China is economically involved in Afghanistan, it's diplomatically involved in Afghanistan. How does China see this peace process evolve? I mean, are they looking at a ceasefire in the short term and then perhaps a more sustainable long-term peace settlement?
I think China always believes that the political solution to the Afghanistan issue is the most important one, because when we look back at the history that the United States launched the war in Afghanistan, and after decades of time that the security situation in Afghanistan is still quite bad. And so the Chinese conclusion would be that the military means alone cannot solve the problem, and we need a kind of a comprehensive approach. We should combine the military, the economic, the political solutions together. So what kind of a political solution can we have? Right now, the peace talk, the peace process, the peace reconciliation process is very important for the current Afghanistan. So so what can we do for these regional countries? Of course, China should cooperate with the United States and with other regional countries, because you know that after President Xi Jinping's getting into power, that he launched the initiative, One Belt, One Road initiative. This initiative asks a peaceful and stable environment around China. So Central Asia is very important, is a region very important for China's One Belt, One Road initiative. So if the security situation within Afghanistan becomes worse and worse, then certainly Central Asia would be threatened. So right now, I think China pays a lot of attention to the security situation in Afghanistan and hope that the political solution, the political peace talk can help to stabilize the security situation in Afghanistan.
Right, Anand, you have got to know the Taliban pretty well. You've traveled with them, you have learned the language. Have you talked with any members of the Taliban recently?
I have, yes. I've spoken to a number of them recently, both to get an understanding of the death of Mullah Omar, which has had profound effects within the movement, as far as I can tell. There have been many senior leaders who did not know that Mullah Omar was dead, has been dead for 2 years, and in fact were receiving letters from somebody they believed to be Mullah Omar. So there's actually been a number of resignations within the Taliban hierarchy just because people are so upset and felt like they have egg on their faces. And so this is a major problem that the Taliban has to deal with.
Ambassador Samad, there are something like 13,000 mainly US troops that remain in Afghanistan. Will this latest surge in violence delay their exit from the country?
Well, there's a commitment to be in Afghanistan for the next couple of years or so, as far as the US and NATO is concerned, after the end of the combat role in 2014. There's going to be obviously more discussions on what shape this is going to take, whether there needs to be a review of the dates and of the structure of this component that is staying, that is mainly for training and advising. I think that if there is more fighting in Afghanistan and stability is threatened in the region, and there's more militancy, because remember, we also have certain pockets of Daesh or Islamic State popping up in our region and inside Afghanistan, that the West, as well as other stakeholders, will probably need to take a harder look at options that exist for the future, and the Afghan government obviously will have its say.